Welcome everyone today. Thanks for joining our webinar on avian bird flu. My name's Christy Spire and I'm the current team leader for nature education here at Green Adelaide. This is the second instalment of our seminar series for 2026, which we run to help share the work that's happening right across Adelaide to help it to be cooler, greener, wilder and more climate resilient. So always like to start these sessions off by acknowledging the country that we are working and learning and sharing from. And for us, that's the land of the Kaurna people. Ngadlu Tampanthi, Ngadlu Ghana, Yatanga, Imparenti. It's good that we acknowledge that we're meeting on Kaurna country today and acknowledge all of the different countries that some of you may be coming and meeting with us from as well, and all the work that you are doing in those places. As we jump in, just for your awareness, this session is being recorded and will be available on the Green Adelaide YouTube channel, so you can catch up at any time that is convenient for you and share it with your colleagues and friends. So let's jump in. H5 avian influenza, or bird flu as it's known, is an increasingly significant global biosecurity issue with serious implications for wildlife. And since 2020, we've seen an unprecedented outbreak spread across almost every continent, causing major impacts on wild birds and other animal species. While Australia remains free of the virus, the risk of arrival is real and preparation is critical. So today's session is all about understanding that risk and what it means for Australia. And we're joined by Karl Hillyard, the Principal Ecologist and H5 Bird Flu Preparedness Coordinator. That's quite a title, with the Department for Environment and Water. Karl will provide a clear and practical overview of what bird flu is, how it's spreading globally, what we might expect if it reaches Australia, and how we're preparing locally, particularly when it comes to protecting wildlife. So thanks so much for being here, Karl. And I'll stop sharing and hand over to you.
So yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for joining today, this talk about H5 bird flu. As being introduced, I'm Karl Hillyard. I'm from the Department for Environment and Water. And most of my work at the moment is focused on preparedness for H5 bird flu. And I'll explain what that is in a little bit. So I work within the Conservation and Wildlife branch of the Department for Environment and Water. When I'm not in this role working on bird flu preparedness, my normal role focuses on wildlife biosecurity, disease conservation, wildlife management issues. And H5 bird flu is part of that, that tapestry around all those wildlife management, conservation and biosecurity things. So I'm acknowledged that I'm joining you today from the land of the Kaurna people, respect their spiritual relationship to the country. I acknowledge Kaurna people as custodians of the Great Adelaide region, and that cultural heritage and beliefs are still important to those people today. So thank you for any Kaurna people or other First Nations people joining us today. And I do note that, as I'll talk to in a moment, that bird flu isn't a fun topic. It's not a great topic. It's going to affect people in many different ways, when it arrives. So I do acknowledge that there's some things in this talk, many things in this talk, which aren't much fun for people who have connection to wildlife, have connection to land. So, I recognise the times we live in with the algal bloom and other things going on, and there's impacts of eco-anxiety. This is a talk which I really try and balance, because I'm not trying to catastrophise this topic. I want to make people aware that it's really important people have an awareness of bird flu. But at the same time, also acknowledge that this isn't a topic which is much fun. So please bear with me, because hopefully you'll learn about what this issue is, what we're doing to prepare for it, and how you can help in this system of preparedness and when bird flu gets here, assuming it does. So I also need to acknowledge what you see on the screen and me talking is underpinned by the work of a lot of people across my agency, across other state government agencies, PIRSA in particular, landscape boards. We work closely, you'll hear we a lot, because this is very much a collective effort across many government departments within the state government level, but then also collaboration with the Australian government and the departments for Ag, Forestry and Food, and Department for Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water, and then other state and territory governments, and then also non-government groups like Wildlife Health Australia. So The knowledge I've got and what I can communicate to you today is really underpinned by the work of many, many people, some of which I know are on the line today. So I thank you all for those who are involved. So as I said, content warning, not a nice topic, something that I'm professionally used to. I do understand that that it's probably a bit normal to me and it may be less normal to others. And at the same time, I'm not trying to catastrophize this, but awareness is really important. So please understand there's some photos of dead animals in here. There's no gory videos. But we're talking about a disease which is really, and we expect and plan to be impactful on our wildlife. So, please just be aware of that. Just back on the overview, I'm going to talk to you about what avian influenza is, what's special about the one we're here talking about today, this H5 bird flu, where that H5 bird flu is now and how do we expect it will get into the country, what we anticipate to happen to wildlife when it gets here, what does H5 bird flu mean for people and what does it look like in animals. I'll talk about what we're doing across the country and then within South Australia to prepare. Specifically, my focus really is on wildlife, but this is a topic which cuts across agricultural sectors, potentially human health sectors. It's a genuine expression of a One Health issue. And we are, the collective, we are taking a One Health approach to this disease and preparedness for it. And I'll conclude with, beyond what's going on, what we're already doing, how you, if you've taken the time on your Wednesday afternoon to join us, what you should be aware of, where to find more information, and how you can help in this space. So, avian influenza. This is avian influenzas generally. Okay, we're going to start from the top and get a little bit more refined as we go. So, avian influenza is caused by the influenza virus. It's the same influenza virus that we humans can get. Given it's that same virus, we know it's highly infectious, highly infectious in wildlife, just as it's highly infectious in humans. I'm going to try and keep this without getting too bogged down, but it's good just to have a little bit of background to what the disease is. And there's 4 types of avian influenza viruses, A, B, C, and D. And birds pretty much exclusively get influenza A, and we humans, we get influenza A and B. If you've ever taken one of the modern influenza rat tests, you'll see it's got bars on there for influenza A and influenza B. So we're talking about an influenza A specifically here. And influenza is a disease with a genetic structure. The virus has a structure that allows for rapid evolution and development of new and different types. And when we talk about those types, you'll hear some N numbers and H numbers, and I'm not going to dwell more than what I need to on that technicality, but effectively, waterfowl and shorebirds are the natural primary host reservoirs for avian influenzas. So any time of the year, ducks, shorebirds, gulls, things like that could have avian influenza, and that's normal. Same as how influenza circulates in the human population. It's normal for influenza to circulate in the wild bird population. And this part, that's fine. It's it's probably not great for those individual animals that get it, but it's not a real issue like the H5 bird flu we're talking about today can be. But avian influenzas can be a significant threat to poultry, wild and captive birds. And I'll talk more on the next slide about what that is and why that is. And because it's the same influenza virus that we humans get, there is a risk of bird flu strains of influenza to humans. It's a zoonotic disease. It can transfer from wildlife into humans. And we do need to take care of ourselves. For people who are up close contact working with birds, but for the general population, that risk is considered generally low. I'll talk a bit more in another slide about that. I don't want to drill down too much into the technical details, as I keep saying, but when we talk about different viruses, we talk about H numbers and N numbers for avian influenzas, and you'll hear me see that H5. What that H means, it's much just out of curiosity because it's not much practical need to know, but that refers to the surface proteins on the outside of the viral particles. The hemagglutinins, that's the H numbers, and the neuraminidase, that's the N numbers. And those H numbers and N numbers are used to categorize the different types of the virus. Okay, so that last point there is this concept of pathogenicity, low pathogenicity and high pathogenicity. That's effectively a descriptor of how the virus expresses itself and how dangerous it is once something gets it. And as I've said, those avian influenza circulates in wild birds normally, and that was typically in a low pathogenic form. Right, so some birds will get sick, some might die, some won't. It generally doesn't kill in that low pathogenic form. What we're concerned about is this high pathogenic form of the H5N1 avian influenza, which is what is really the focus of this talk. So this new strain of high pathogenicity avian influenza has emerged, the H5N1 clade 2.3.4.4b. I'm not going to talk with those numbers anymore. If you hear me talking about bird flu, this is pretty much what I'm talking about, the H5 avian influenza or H5 bird flu. So what you can see on this diagram, if you start up in the top left of the screen, is low path LPAI and HPAI in wild birds. And what normally happens is pretty much just that blue arrow, that one that runs between the wild birds and a farm. Right? And so what normally happens is those wild birds might mix in with some production bird species, chickens and those sorts of things, transfer a low pathogenic form into a chicken farm, and that's where viral changes in evolution can occur and convert into a high pathogenic form. Right, and this happens from time to time. We've been fortunate in Australia not to have frequent high path avian influenza outbreaks, but you might be familiar with some high pathogenicity avian influenza outbreaks which occurred in Victoria and New South Wales and the ACT a couple of years ago. It was a different type of avian influenza, a H7 strain of avian influenza, so not what we're talking about today. But this H5 strain that we're talking about today is weird because it's circulating in a high pathogenic form among wild birds and also now, unfortunately, wild mammals. This isn't the norm, and that's what's expressed in those orange arrows joining the different diagrams. So where the normal low pathogenic to high pathogenic process really just starts with wild birds and ends with production species, what's going on with the H5 bird flu is that zoonotic potential, that potential spread to humans, that goes straight down from the wild birds in the top left. It goes from wild birds to wild mammals, that diagonal line falling to the bottom right, and then can also be spread in this high pathogenic form into farms directly and then among farms, right? And that's why this is different. And that's why it's a concern, because we're not used to having those high pathogenic forms spreading in the wild. So the H5 bird flu we're here talking about, it's not here in Australia, which is great. We don't want it to come. I hope that 5 years from now, we're still here talking about preparedness for H5 bird flu. It's a much better scenario than it does turn up. But we know from its impacts overseas that it's likely to get here. And once it gets here, it'll affect wild birds and mammals as it has overseas. It'll likely persist and spread in wildlife. And we see that from what's gone overseas, where there's there's now more than 500 wild bird species overseas that have been affected and around 80 species of terrestrial and aquatic mammals. So what's moving around, what's going to be affected? Well, it's wild birds, it's seabirds, it's shorebirds, it's potentially raptors being affected and also spreading it. And then in wild mammals, it's meat eaters and scavengers, including marine species like pinnipeds, our seals, and our sea lions, which is what we have some pretty significant concerns for. It's impacting also on production species, so production chicken and ducks. And you might have read some of the news from overseas where it has moved into some production and domestic mammals as well. So dairy cattle, cats, mink overseas, which have been affected. As I've said, and as you'll hear a little bit more, it is a zoonotic disease. It can transfer from wildlife to people. And that's mostly, by and large, people with very close contact with wild birds, okay, or domestic and production species birds. So for the general population, it's not of immediate concern, but it's something to be aware of. So key points here, H5 bird flu is circulating. It's not here in Australia. It's had some pretty concerning impacts on wildlife overseas. And this slide talks about the spread of the disease. So this particular type of H5 bird flu emerged in the mid-90s, in about 1996, and it did cause sporadic outbreaks in wild bird populations and has done so since about 2005. But this particular event that we're going through now and we're preparing for now really kicked off in sort of 2020 and beyond, where it's now effectively spread globally. And you can see on this map here that shows it spreads from North Africa and from Europe, across from Europe to Asia, across from Europe into North America. It's hit North America from both Asia and from Europe. It's travelled down the Americas from North America to South America. Sadly, we had news in February 2024 of confirmed cases down into Antarctica, and it's been circulating through that period also in Africa as well. So since February of 2024, it's made that sort of eastward movement from South America eastwards towards Australia, moving across subantarctic islands. Now, if I'd given this talk 6 months ago, that'd be the map. But what the map at the moment is, you might have seen and heard some news from late last year in 2025 and only a few weeks ago, where sadly there were confirmed cases in an Australian Antarctic territory, the Heard Islands and McDonald Islands, where that arrow points to in the bottom of the map there. So, yeah, H5 bird flu has been circulating for a number of years, and we're really fortunate that basically Australia, New Zealand and Oceania are free. So those dots in the map, the sort of darker red dots show reported infections or detections in wild birds, whereas the more red-coloured ones are in poultry species, in domestic or production species. So the takeaway is that this is a disease around us, and it could turn up here, and it's something for us to be prepared for. And this kind of begs the question, how is it going to get here? Well, as I've said, avian influenzas are normally moved around by wild birds, things like ducks, things like shorebirds, seabirds, those sorts of things. So because of the potential gravity of this disease, a lot of work has gone into trying to understand what are those pathways for entry of H5 bird flu into Australia. And the identified main sort of pathways of concern from wild animals are from long distance migratory birds. So migratory waders and shorebirds that move down from northern parts of Asia into the southern hemisphere, which typically occurs in spring. There's also concerns about the movement of nomadic waterfowl. So waterfowl species, things like ducks that move around throughout Australia and up into what might be sort of framed as the Australopian region or Sahul. So that area that encompasses parts of Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, some of those areas which potentially have local infections of H5 bird flu as well. And as I said on the last slide, there has been that movement of the bird flu into Antarctica and across subantarctic islands. And that's now recognised as a potential other pathway of the disease. So to some degree, we are getting increasingly hemmed in here in Australia, and we are fortunate that we've had a good time span with the disease not moving here in the current form that it is. But it is why we need to prepare. So from those natural movements, that's what we are thinking about of how the disease might get here through those long-distance migrants, those locally nomadic species, and from those vagrant subantarctic, Antarctic species, or nomadic or migratory species that move amongst the southern hemisphere. So, yeah, we've got some pretty good understanding of how it might get here, and we've got some broad understanding of when. All right, so those duck movements, because they're nomadic movements in response to habitat availability and resource availability, they go on year-round. Incursions from the Antarctic, subantarctic region are potentially also probably year-round as well. We know that we get vagrant seals, we get vagrant penguins turning up from time to time, a range of other migratory or vagrant marine birds that do appear from subantarctic territories, Antarctic territories. But spring's often cited as a particularly high-risk time because of those migrant, long-distance migratory birds which come in from the northern hemisphere. But I think we really are now at a point where we do need to be alert year-round to the potential for the incursion of this disease, and just be prepared for, if we see something unusual, to report it in. And I'll talk more on a later slide about that. I don't need to dwell a great deal on human health. I'm certainly not a human doctor and a human health professional. But we do know that H5 bird flu is a zoonotic disease. And like other bird flus, there is a small chance of human spread, but that's considered exceedingly rare. So for most people out there in the community, there's a really low risk from avian influenza. But it is important to recognise that it's a zoonotic disease. I know some people joining today who might watch this are people who are in those groups that might be at higher risk of exposure to the disease because they work in close contact with birds, they work in some sort of conservation work, or have pet birds and these sorts of things. So it's important to have a broad understanding. I'm not trying to say this in any catastrophic way. It is just for information about that awareness that there is, for people in certain professions or voluntary capacities or keeping pet animals and those sorts of things, it's something to have an awareness of. So the route of infection, whether that's for animals or from animals to humans, is through spread of respiratory droplets, contaminated dust, infected with respiratory droplets from infected animals. Like our familiarity with things like COVID and the flu generally, having contaminated materials in our hands, whether that's blood, whether that's feces, whether it's respiratory droplets, touching that to our eyes, nose or mouth are all risk pathways for getting into us. So if you're not in close contact with animals, this is really low risk. It's rare, but it can be consequential to those people who get it. Okay, it presents in people like typical flu in people, and it is just important for people who are in those fields where they do have close contact to be aware and take steps and understand how they can protect themselves. Sorry, I'm just going to check my notes on that one. Sorry, it's always worth coming back to some important parts of this, that properly handled and prepared food, poultry products are safe to eat. My understanding is there's not a risk to people of getting infected by consuming eggs, chicken meat, if it's properly handled. That's the same as whatever the situation is. Cook your food properly, prepare it and handle it properly, undertake appropriate hygiene practices. You shouldn't be concerned about that in any way. I talked at the start about this not being a nice topic and those potential for mental health impacts from a bird flu incursion. I think we've learnt a lot and seen a lot of unpleasant things with the harmful algal bloom. That bird flu could be analogous too. We just don't know. That is one of our challenges around how bird flu will affect our wildlife here. We think we understand, we're taking a plan for the worst, hope for the best perspective. But I'm conscious that this isn't a pleasant topic. We are going through a time when we have all sorts of issues going on in the environment, the algal bloom, climate change, those sorts of things. And there is that issue that bird flu could be additive to that as well. So part of giving the talks like this is to build that awareness. So things like this, if they do occur, aren't a surprise. And it is important to, that we do support people and support each other, recognising that can be an issue and something to be attentive to. So the next slide, if you don't like photos of dead animals, does have photos of dead animals. This is effectively what has occurred. This is bringing ourselves back to wildlife. These are photos from Antarctica, from South America, showing how wild birds, wild marine mammals have been affected. And this is likely to be consequential. We're expecting it could well be consequential when it does arrive in terms of its impacts on wildlife. And that's why I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing to prepare to respond, and also try and prepare our wildlife to be as resilient as possible to the disease. So it has affected tens, if not, certainly tens of thousands of marine mammals overseas. It's affected hundreds of thousands of water birds, seabirds overseas. It is a highly virulent disease. It is something, once it gets here, we think will be impactful in our wildlife. Part of our challenge is we don't understand exactly, and we can't, because of the nature of our wildlife and our isolation here in Australia, how exactly that will manifest once it does get here. So we are working to that sort of, it's a bit of a hackneyed statement, but we're prepare for the worst, hope for the best. We're working to that assumption that arrival will be inevitable. But as I've said, we've got some idea of times when there are different levels of risk, but we can't really tell with great certainty exactly where or when. But we do anticipate once H5 bird flu gets to Australia, it'll be here to stay, and that it'll become what would be categorised as an endemic disease, becomes normalised here in our environment. Unfortunately, it is a highly pathogenic disease, which means mortality rates for wildlife will be assumed to be high. So once an animal gets sick, we don't have practical treatments. Okay, so it's going to be really tough to see the disease arrive and affect our wildlife. And there's probably little we can do directly to treat animals. It's worth touching briefly on vaccines for wild birds and wild mammals generally. And there are avian influenza vaccines that are available, but in a wildlife context, they're not generally practical. And that's because at the moment, those vaccines require at least 2 doses, and that's not really a practicality for wild animals. Excuse me. So work and really interesting and useful work is going on for vaccines, which has some utility for captive animals. And those animals in things like captive breeding programs where they are held in captivity for a period where we hope in future we'll be able to use vaccines to protect some of those animals. So vaccines are a work in progress and something which is a really good glimmer of hope to help protect some of our more threatened species. But it's not a silver bullet. Okay. And further, those vaccines at the moment are for birds. We don't have vaccines for wild mammals. This is something that we're hopeful for, but it's not something that's expected to be realised in the immediate few years. So when it gets here, it's going to be really tough because we're going to have really limited response actions. And that's what we're planning for now, to understand those potential response actions, what's practical, what's not, what's going to be most effective to help protect our wildlife, keep people safe as well. Okay, so we anticipate that that could be things like closing areas to protect wildlife to minimise disturbance. We're considering what the practicality is for carcass removal, trying to understand from overseas if carcasses are removed from the landscape, can that decrease the rate of infection? It won't stop it, but maybe there's something that's useful. But what we're seeing from overseas, unfortunately, despite several years of these outbreaks occurring, is that there's not strong evidence coming through of these response actions. So that's why some of these preparedness actions and getting ready for recovery actions after our bird flu has arrived becomes probably all the more important. Who's doing what to prepare? And, avian influenza is one of probably many emergency animal diseases which my colleagues in agricultural agencies, primary industries in region South Australia here in SA, Department for Ag, Forestry and Fisheries at the national level, this is business as usual for them. They're always dealing with emergency animal diseases. That's part of routine business for ag agencies. And so at a national scale, national biosecurity responses are coordinated for the Department for Ag, Fisheries and Forestry, DAF, and at state level through state agencies like here in SA. And we're really fortunate from a wildlife perspective that those agencies are experienced and well rehearsed in managing emergency animal disease outbreaks. They have systems and processes in place and are working to refine those for the wildlife impacts that we expect from H5 bird flu. The seriousness of that is underpinned by funding that has been provided by the Australian government, which we're seeing, and I'll talk about some of the projects that we're implementing with that $100 million funding package that's come from the Australian government to prepare, and that preparedness spans across environment, agricultural and health sectors, human health sectors. And there's really useful things going on across all those sectors to get us ready. You know, health probably straightforward, that's a human health matter, that's just general preparedness. But across both environment and ag sectors, great work going that is supportive and interrelated across wildlife and production, agricultural species that's that's being done and being progressed. So we already have emergency funding response deeds to help fund responses when outbreaks and disease occur. We've got those in place. They've been standing in place for many years for production species, and we've implemented a similar response deed for wildlife, specifically the National Management Agreement for HPAI and H5 HPAI and wildlife that's ready to go when H5 bird flu arrives here in Australia. And I need to give a special mention to colleagues from my national counterparts in the Australian government, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, Water, who are leading this environmental work as it's framed, which is really helping support our wildlife here in South Australia and indeed across the country. And they're through that funding, that $100 million from the Australian government is where we're delivering a lot of our preparedness actions for species we anticipate, and I'll show you what that is in a couple more slides. So here at a state scale, as I've said, PIRS are the lead agency for animal, plant and marine diseases, things like bird flu. They have systems and processes in place where they're well rehearsed and well prepared for such things. And my agency, the Department for Environment and Water, is working closely with them to make sure that we can do what we can now to prepare wildlife here, prepare ourselves to respond. So, DW is a participating agency here to support PIRSA, and my agency's role has really been to support that planning for wildlife, for threatened species in that preparedness phase, and being ready to help PIRSA with response should the disease arrive. Other government agencies, SA Health, the EPA, landscape boards, a wider range of others are also preparing should this arrive. So we're very fortunate we have had this lead time to get ready and doing much coordination wise to do so. So we're talking about surveillance just briefly here. As I've said, avian influenzas, this particular H5 strain of avian influenza is a bit different and unusual, but avian influenzas are a long-standing matter of concern, but mostly for sort of production context, not for environmental contexts. But because of that long-standing concern, there has been in place since 2005 the National Avian Influenza Wild Bird Surveillance Program, which works across the country to undertake wild bird avian influenza surveillance and for other exotic diseases in wild birds. It's funded by the Australian Government, Department for Ag, Forestry and Fisheries, and here in South Australia, that surveillance is conducted by PIRSA. Part of that surveillance includes both targeted and general surveillance. So when I say targeted, that's proactive collection of samples from birds or from the environment. So here in SA, that typically goes on at locations around the Coorong, locations out at Bolivar. There are routine sites where sampling goes on, like you can see one of our colleagues there, collecting environmental samples to screen for diseases like avian influenza, including the H5 avian influenza. That's a really long-standing useful program, and as you can see for the stats there, over 135,000 wild bird tests have occurred since 2005, and high pathogenic forms of avian influenza have not been detected in the wild. But low pathogenic forms do get detected from time to time, and as I said at the start, that's normal. Wild birds carry diseases the same as humans carry diseases, so that's a normal thing. But with this H5 bird flu concern ramping up, we have been adding extra sites in South Australia to enhance that targeted surveillance, looking at some of our offshore islands, which are important locations for threatened species like pinnipeds and a range of seabirds. We've been adding some extra surveillance in the Coorong, working around the Adelaide International Bird Sanctuary, up in the Lake Eyre region. Of course, would many of us be familiar with the inundation that's going on up there, and then the attractiveness of those locations to birds. So some surveillance has been going on there, and also surveilling wetlands in the Palmerston Coast region. So we're out there looking. That's an important thing to take away. There is a system and process out there that's looking for that surveillance, undertaking that now. But I'll talk more about how you can be part of that surveillance system, and indeed all of us are potentially part of that surveillance system. And I'll explain how that general surveillance, which is responding to reports of unusually sick birds or mortality events, where people can contribute to that. Otherwise, preparedness-wise, as I've said, PIRSA are our lead agency for emergency animal diseases. They've convened a cross-government working group with many of those agencies I spoke about before. Across government, PIRSA, DW, other government agencies, there's a lot of work going on with this fortunate time that we have to do what we can to prepare. So a lot of planning work, preparedness response plans specific to H5 bird flu for wildlife. So ensuring we've got those plans developed. I'll talk about some more of what we're doing specifically for wildlife on the next slide. Also training and engaging with industries, engaging with sectors that are likely to be involved or impacted by H5 bird flu. So PIRSA has been working with the poultry industry. We anticipate that there could be impacts of this H5 bird flu, not just in wildlife, into poultry, and so engagement there. Working with government agencies who are likely to be on the ground in response to train, keeping ourselves safe, to do effective surveillance, how we don and doff personal protective equipment, how we collect samples effectively. Doing webinars and presentations and talks like this one. So out there talking to people to raise awareness, make sure people understand what's going on, what they can think to do preparedness-wise, what they should do if they see something unusual. Working across different sectors, vets, wildlife, rehab sectors, a whole range of government agencies. It's been great work going on in capital investments, getting infrastructure and equipment ready to go. And communications, that links to training as well. So both practical aspects. We're really fortunate we have national and state level communications for planning and preparedness. A lot of engagement and education going with partner agencies, industries, vets, wildlife professionals, as we're doing here today. And also broad public communications. We've obviously had the harmful algal bloom going on in South Australia, and that has put a little bit of a pause on some of the communications around bird flu. But it's something that we have been continuing to talk about. So, we are doing a lot. We're doing a lot now to do things to help prepare should bird flu arrive. And so here for us at sort of this wildlife scale, I'm really going to pull some focus back into wildlife now. We're fortunate to have some of that Australian government funding to do wildlife-specific regional and site preparedness plans. We've done a lot of steps to sort of learn and understand about biosecurity practices across the state. We have some really good understanding of what the species here in South Australia we anticipate could be affected, where they are, and then what we can do for those preparedness, response and recovery type actions should bird flu arrive. So here within my own agency, DW, we're writing region and site plans. So focused at our 7 DW operational regions and our staff across there, working collaboratively with landscape board staff across those regions to understand exactly what the wildlife are, where the wildlife are, those sorts of activities we can do now to build resilience in wildlife, the actions we might take when bird flu arrives, and what we might do as recovery actions once outbreaks have subsided. And we're also looking at sites of conservation or operational significance. So, we're very fortunate to have many sort of national park conservation parks here in South Australia. And a lot of those are there because they are attractive to threatened wildlife and species which we anticipate could be affected. So we've been putting particular emphasis on places like the Coorong, Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth, which are of course world renowned for their migratory, they're attractive to migratory shorebirds. Thinking about places like the Kunzi Lakes Ramblers sites, places like the Adelaide Dolphin Sanctuary and the Adelaide International Bird Sanctuary. We're thinking about things which we manage under permit, whether they be research permits, these sorts of things where we have a regulatory role enabling people to interact with wildlife in the way that the normal public can't. So trying to understand what the biosecurity implications of those different places and activities and the things that live in them are so that we can prepare ourselves well. So we're also working on a range of other policy and procedural response type documents to set us in as best stead as we can, given those uncertainties. And I do need to keep coming back to those uncertainties because it is a challenge for us. We're taking a broad approach to prepare, and we will have to be dynamic in a response to tailor our preparedness to whatever the actual situation is, which will be potentially a real challenge, but something we are working towards. So as well as those site plans and regional plans, we're working on species preparedness plans for Australian sea lion and long-nosed fur seal. So many of you will be familiar that Australian sea lions are endemic to Australia. There's about 12,000 of them. They're the sort of species which, from what we've seen overseas, we do have concerns about. Similarly, long-nosed fur seals now, we've many more long-nosed fur seals. They're not endemic specifically to Australia, but because of the number of them and the impacts we've seen on seals and sea lions, pinnipeds overseas, we do have concerns as well for their welfare and working on them as well. So within those region, site and species plans, looking at those, as I said, preparedness, response and recovery type actions to do what we can to either build resilience in wildlife populations before it arrives, understand what sort of actions we can take while there is an outbreak going on, and then understand what actions we might then take to sort of rebuild those populations after an outbreak subsided. And these sort of plans get into sort of those details around those conservation activities and those response activities exactly on ground, what we are likely to do. So, trying to be as well prepared as what we can. And we're really that we have been able to implement some of those preparedness conservation actions. And I'll talk to that sort of as we conclude. So Australian sea lions, as I've said, our concerns about the susceptibility given their existing threatened status. We've been working, my agency DW, with our Commonwealth partners with funding from the Australian government, working with a range of partner organisations through SARDI, Flinders Uni, the University of Sydney, the Kangaroo Island Landscape Board and Sea Shepherd Australia, to do resilience building actions. Because we can't stop bird flu, we can't prevent its incursion, we can't really treat wildlife once it gets here. what our aim is to build resilient populations. So what I mean by building resilience is building larger populations, healthier populations that we hope can be more able to survive the impacts of the disease when it arrives. So the images you see here on this screen, some of the work that we're doing to build that resilience for Australian sea lions, where we're treating existing issues, existing stresses that impact upon that species to build that resilience. So what you see on the left of the screen there is some work that's going on to treat hookworm in sea lions. Sea lions are susceptible to hookworm. They get hookworm now. That hookworm has been shown to lower their rate of recruitment, how many young transition into the adult population, and health of those animals as well. So we've been working with our partners there to do topical treatments for that hookworm to hopefully increase pup health and pup survival, and working across a range of important breeding colonies to do so. Trying to treat cohorts, leveraging off of work that's been going on for a number of years to expand and operationalise what's been done and understood through research, and transitioning that now into conservation actions. The middle photo there, Australian sea lion sitting in what we call a pup shelter. So with our changing climate, with those impacts of climate change, many of the breeding colonies for sea lions are on exposed rocky islands, those sorts of places. And there are some concerns there about the impacts of heat stress on those animals. So what the pup shelters seek to do is provide some thermal refuge for pups, and also shelter for pups, because unfortunately numbers of them do get squashed by adults or competing juveniles, playing juveniles. So between the heat stress and what we'd call that conspecific trauma, those impacts from other animals, trying to install pup shelters at a range of sites, a range of breeding locations, to offer them that shelter and assess how those shelters perform for providing that reduction in thermal stress and protection. And on the right of screen there is a feral cat trap. So feral cats, this work's going on Kangaroo Island around Seal Bay. Many of you will be familiar with the impacts of feral cats on our native wildlife. And one of those impacts, feral cats don't predate on sea lions, but they can carry diseases which are of concern to pinnipeds. And feral cats themselves are potentially going to be affected by H5 bird flu, so a potential vector of the disease once it arrives here. So working with our partners from the Kangaroo Island Landscape Board to undertake some of and expand some of the existing great feral cat control work they've been doing on the Dudley Peninsula, and expand that to some of the other locations of the island where Australian sea lions are. All this work being done, as I've said, to really build resilience. Other threat mitigation projects, which are less species specific, but are really being targeted at migratory bird species, shorebirds, wetland birds, and wetland habitats. We've currently got 4 projects up and running with partners across the state, looking at pig control work up at the Kunji Lakes, up in the top right-hand corner there, working on feral cat, fox control and habitat improvements down in the Limestone Coast wetlands, including the Coorong, down there in the bottom right-hand corner. We've got some work going on through Green Adelaide, working in the Adelaide International Bird Sanctuary and on the Metro Coastline, looking at feral cat and fox control to improve conditions out there for some of our shorebird species like hooded plovers, which is really good. We're also doing some work with the Hills and Fleurieu Landscape Board and other partners around part of the lower lakes and the Counter Coast Islands, where we're also doing feral cat and fox control, weed control and revegetation, and feral bird control. So like what I talked about before with the Australian sea lions, trying to do work now to build resilience in existing wildlife populations, whether they be threatened species or more common species that might well be impacted, so that we've got healthier and more abundant populations before the disease arrives. So this is some great work going on using that Australian government funding that we're translating to real conservation on action here on the ground, that we hope to really benefit those wildlife species before the disease arrives. So I've told you, how this is a pretty mediocre story about bird flu. We are trying to do great things to prepare and get our wildlife ready as best we can. And it always comes also in these sort of talks going, I don't want people to feel entirely helpless to this. So, what can you do to help? Well, the fact that you're here listening to this talk, you're becoming aware of bird flu. That's really useful. To have that awareness, have that understanding. I'll talk to you on the next slide about what signs of the disease to look for. So if you're out in the environment and you see something unusual, I'll also talk to you about what to do next. If you need more information, and I'm skimming the surface with this talk, and there's so much information, there's so much to understand, knowing where to go for more information, that's something that we'll share out to all of you, some links to the key websites We can get more information across for wildlife through our own agency's website, through PIRSA, Primary Industries, through SA Health and through Australian government agencies. There's lots of really good, useful, factual, simple information out there to help people understand. I always like to sort of come back to these points around also doing something to help conserve wildlife. Like I suspect if you're, as I said, tuning in at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday, you're probably someone who has a keen interest. But whether it's for H5 bird flu or generally, doing things to help conserve wildlife habitats is a useful thing. And what I mean by that is joining your local Friends Park or a local government-related environment group, a land care group. All great things to do. Appreciating wildlife at a safe distance in national parks are all good things. Being aware, being familiar. So, whilst this is a bit of a story of doom and gloom, there are practical things that people can do. Which brings me on to, and again, apologies in the next slide, photo of an animal that's probably quite ill and was hopefully euthanized soon after this photo was taken. But that's understanding what to look for in wild birds. So if you're out and about and you do see something unusual, we do expect, as I've said, H5 bird flu is expected to affect wild birds and wild mammals. We do expect to see this in birds first. So educating you, if you see unusual things in wild birds, this is what people should be looking for if they're out and about on a beach, on a wetland, on a lake, wherever, out in your community, out in a park and garden, and you see birds with unusual behaviours, neurological signs, so incoordination, tremors, swimming in circles, doing weird things, twisted necks, abnormal postures. Despite being a respiratory disease, it is having these neurological impacts on animals. It's a respiratory disease, so we will expect to see respiratory signs in animals: breathing, coughing, sneezing, unusual swelling, gastrointestinal impacts, strange, looks to the face and the eyes. But what we might well expect to see is just sudden death. It is a really impactful disease that, based off of the overseas experience, it may be a matter of only a couple of days between an animal getting sick and then dying. So what people might well find is just unusual dead animals, mass die-offs of animals potentially. So having this understanding of what you're looking for brings me to my next point, is knowing what to do if you see something unusual. And our big takeaways for you today, please, is understanding, what to do if you do see something unusual. And the messaging that's keen and consistent from us is avoiding touching those sick things. So if you see sick, see dead birds, please don't touch them, unless someone, has instructed you to do so, which is probably not going to happen. But it's avoid, record, and report is our key message. So don't touch sick or dead dying birds. If you do see something, please record what you see. Okay, time, date, place, the species you think might be involved. Photos, videos are all really important things to help government agencies, primary industries and regions, my organisation DW, to assess reports. Okay, so if you've seen something unusual and you've not touched it, record the information, reporting to the Emergency Animal Disease Hotline. It's my main takeaway for you, please, today. Putting that 1-800 number, 1-800-675-888 into your phones. If you're out and about, you see something weird, please phone it into the Emergency Animal Disease Hotline. That's the best thing people can do on a day-to-day basis to really be assistance. Be those eyes and ears. As I said before, you can be part of that surveillance system, and recording that number on your phone, recording if you see something unusual and reporting it in, is some of the best things for everyone to help with. So reports that go to those hotlines, those go to PIRSA here in South Australia. They go to ag and biosecurity agencies across the country. It is the same number across the country. If you're travelling for another state, once reports are made to that hotline, they're assessed. They might not be action. They might not be immediate concern, but reporting them in is really important in case they are, because people who answer those phones will assess what the report is, listen to what you have to say, listen to what you've seen, and make an assessment as to whether it's potentially bird flu, maybe some animal disease, or maybe just something that's totally innocuous, which in many cases it is. But those key messages of avoid, record, and report, please just remember that and put that 1-800-675-888 number in your phone. And that's how we can all out there, doing the things we do, see and contribute and help, because that first report, making that report in, getting that understanding of if the disease is here, allows us to trigger those actions to respond to help protect wildlife. And on that note, I really thank you for your time. Thank you for joining in for, as I've said, not the most joyful talk, But coming here and listening, really important. Some links there, which will be shared, they'll be emailed out after the talk. But those are places to go for further information in detail if you need it. And as I can't say enough, putting the emergency animal disease hotline on your phone is a great thing to do. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Karl. Lots of little applauses coming up on my screen. I hope you can see those too. So yeah, I think everyone's found it a really comprehensive chat. And I do have a few questions for you. And I think maybe you may have mentioned it at the start, but there was interest just around where the H5 strain originated. Do they know that? Or did you mention that?
No, I didn't mention that. Like the H5 strain's been recognised, as I understand it, since about 1996, and relates back to some farms in China, is my understanding. But this particular panzoonotic event has really sort of moved out of North Africa and Europe over those last sort of 5 or 6 years. So, yeah.
Yeah. And another one, just in terms of more of the overseas experience that you may or may not be aware of, but does the impact vary significantly between different wildlife species, or is that data not really known at this point?
It is a real mixed bag out there from what we, we're doing our best to learn a lot from overseas experiences and knowledge. And, there's an overwhelming amount of information. And what we understand is that the impacts can be variable. And I'm not an epidemiologist, let alone a virologist, but what I do understand is when disease lands, it can interact with the local avian influenzas and the local fauna. And it really depends on the familiarity of those local wildlife to other avian influenzas of how significant the impacts are. So I think it's going to be, from my understanding, it's a real challenge to understand exactly how it will affect our fauna here, which is where we just have to sort of take that pessimistic view that it's going to be pretty bad and plan to that. And, we are, as I said, trying to learn a lot from overseas. And those key messages we often hear from overseas colleagues is whatever you think it's going to be, it's not going to be that. So that's a really challenging place to work from, but it does reflect how dynamic the situation is globally. So, I think we're putting our best foot forward with the things and how we are preparing so that we can adapt to what occurs here when it does happen.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, great to see. And people have made a few comments on that. Just knowing a little bit more about the preparations that are being put in place is excellent to see as well. We've got a few people that are, of course, very active and concerned about our local endangered shorebirds and the hooded plovers. Is there any extra management that can be done with populations to protect them in their breeding? Just lots of concern about, particularly those species. So I'm imagining some of these people are the awesome volunteers that help with them as well. But I think you've outlined a few of those things. But anything in particular from your experience with the bird sanctuary?
My observations there would be that anything we're doing now to help conserve those species are useful things to be doing to prepare for bird flu. If for species like hooded plovers, all that great work that's going on to protect those breeding locations, educate people on how they can be impactful or reduce their impacts when they use our beaches and those shared locations, that's great, full stop, whether it's generally or for H5 bird flu. The additional work that's been going on looking at how we manage feral predators, foxes and cats, it is extra work that's a great opportunity to sort of enhance existing work. So my general take is because we can't stop the disease and we can't really treat the disease, we just have to do what we can to boost populations. Now, more animals, healthier animals. So all those conservation activities already rolling is what we are trying to do more of.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. There's some concern about dead birds not being collected off of a local beach, even after calling the hotline. So should there be more proactive in collecting them, and that kind of thing? I'm imagining, especially with all the other things that people have been dealing with on our coastlines at the moment, that there's potentially. Sometimes there's just not enough time in the day to get out to all of the calls.
Look, I think my understanding there is that the advice around reporting wildlife potentially impacted by algal blooms and bird flu is generally the same. And there's sort of different operational practices that might all take place. This is operationally a response for bird flu will be led by PIRSA. So I don't really want to put words in their mouth from that perspective. But my understanding is, that importance of reporting is key, and understanding that people receiving those reports will assess what's reported. I know those reports get read, they get assessed by people who have a good understanding of things like bird flu to work out is this of something of immediate concern from a bird flu perspective? What further investigation should go on? We know before the algal bloom, we know with the algal bloom, wildlife washes up on beaches, okay? Like, I'm not trying to take away from those things. It's not unusual for wildlife to be dead on beaches, but I think the algal bloom has really brought this into focus and attention, which is great. This is great that people are paying attention. I know I'm out there on the beaches and looking at those things and thinking about that and thinking about algal bloom impacts, bird flu impacts, and a whole range of things. But I think that key point is, reporting that in to the emergency animal disease hotline, those sources, letting those people make those assessments, provide guidance. Beaches can be tricky places to work on as well. I have some sympathy for those who have to go out there on the ground and deal with those carcasses. So I know that, work is done to consider and respond where it's practical to do so.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. So keep reporting. And there's a couple of questions just from Paul. I think this relates more so to, people's backyards and preparing that for, how they can look after their chooks and if dogs and cats will be at risk. So is there any kind of place that we can send people, or any key messages just around, households or urban households?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not going to go into detail because it's not my area of expertise, but those links, which I think you can still see on your screen, have information for people in backyards, backyard chickens, pets, those sorts of things, how they can prepare their animals, what they can do to take care. We understand, pets are so important. Lots of people got backyard chickens. There's great advice out there on linked off of the birdflu.gov.au website, and I'm pretty sure the same links are also on the PIRSA bird flu website linked as well. So plenty of information can be found. Going to those trusted sources is a really great place to get the right information that will help give people practical insights to what they can do before bird flu gets here, and what it's worth considering once it's confirmed to be here.
Awesome. Some people are answering each other's questions, which always happens as well, which is great, which is always good. Another question here is, what ranges of population survival rates are being recorded overseas? I suppose that's mixed as well across all of those different species, but maybe that's somewhere that we can direct people to dig deeper if they want to as well.
Yeah, it's hard to generalise there because it is varied, where we do see some pretty catastrophic numbers in terms of impact. And at the same time, this is the challenge of the various localisations of how the disease expresses once it gets to a place. So it's easy to dwell on those catastrophic numbers, but at the same time, it's really going to come down to what happens locally, and that will be our challenge, to see and be ready to respond. So not easy to give a definitive answer to that one, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. And awesome. There's a few people that, some obviously committed volunteers already online that are doing some shorebird citizen science. What can we do to manage our own health in proximity to the potential of H5? I'm sure BirdLife Australia and some of those other groups that are supporting those citizen science activities will provide support for volunteers and for what you need to do. But if there's any final tips from you, Karl?
Look, I think the simple tips is, if you're in those people who are up and close, people like bird banders and those sorts of things, or, if you're just out bird watching, remember that advice, don't touch sick and dead wildlife. Generally not a good idea, whether it's bird flu or anything else. Avoiding that as best we can. Basic personal protective equipment. There's great guidance linked on those websites. I know that BirdLife Australia has shared that guidance with their members and volunteers. great advice there. Wildlife Health has really good guidance as well for people closer to those direct connectedness through to wildlife to help. Because whether it's bird flu or whether it's other diseases, there are a range of zoonotic diseases out there in the environment that people could be exposing themselves to. So, you know, my general go-to advice is masks, gloves, eye protection, long sleeve, long pants, good hand hygiene. You know, that any time you're touching wildlife, touching animals, is a probably good place to start. Take good care. You know, we learn a lot about being good with hand washing and things during COVID years. Getting back to that, and remembering that's good to keep ourselves healthy. But great advice can be found at those sources.
Fantastic. And yeah, great. Key message for everyone to take away in terms of go and get involved in some sort of wildlife conservation, because it helps with all of these things. And great to see so many people online that are already involved and active, and hopefully we'll be keen to encourage more people to get active after today as well. So thank you so much, Karl, for joining us today and putting this together, and all the work that you and all of your partners across the country are doing. It's really good to hear about it. And for everyone that's joined us live, or if you're watching this later, we'll also send out an email with lots of these links, and so that you can go back to them when you're out and about. But yeah, reminder to pop that phone number in your phone right now as you're with us. And just a reminder that our next session will actually be celebrating the 10th birthday of Adelaide's International Bird Sanctuary. And we're hosting that one on Wednesday, the 29th of April. So we hope that you can join us and hear about all the excellent work that has been done to protect that part of Adelaide. So thank you so much for making time today at the end of your day, and for celebrating and helping us all to be prepared. So thanks for all your work, Karl, and take care, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks, everyone.